So welcome to today's study. And those of you online, could you just confirm that you can actually hear me? Once again, the sound was conspicuously absent. All good? Great. Thank you very much. Okay, so we're studying Khenpo Tsultrim Gyamtso Rinpoche's teaching called the Progressive Stages of Meditation on Emptiness. And emptiness in the Buddhist teaching is not so much something about ending up in some sort of incredible void, but it's just accustoming ourselves to the fact that we cannot grasp our reality. So that's where we kind of run our head against the wall continuously, because we think that the perceptions we have actually represent something truly existing. And similarly, also the psychological dimension of self, that is the perceiver, also is taken to be something that is truly unitary, unchanging. And that's where we actually fail to understand reality. And what the Buddha wished for was for us to get out of this delusional condition. And this is actually what the whole path the Buddha taught is about, simply to eliminate the condition of delusion, to eliminate something that we're assuming that actually is flawed. And very simply, the beauty of what the Buddha is saying is not, so the Buddha is not trying to press some sort of new cosmic law down over us or trying to initiate us into something deep and mysterious. The Buddha is just saying, please look at reality. Please just look. And that's where we have the notion of vipassana, the wider perspective that differs from what we could say we normally have, which is a rather narrow perspective. So all the Buddha is really intending for us with all the various teachings that he gives is really for us to just have a hard look at reality and take it from there. And that's where the Buddha, a little bit like if we're sitting in the movie hall and we're completely petrified by some horror that's happening in the movie, and somebody gently nudges us and say, hey, take it easy, it's just a movie. So that's where the Buddha comes in and says, take it easy, it's not what it appears. And that's where the Buddha introduces this dimension that we sometimes, and it could be misleading sometimes, we refer to it as emptiness. And like I said, it really just refers to the fact that everything we perceive in terms of subject and object actually cannot be grasped the way we think it exists and where we mistakenly think that it exists as solid. So the Buddha gives us some encouragement to have a look, but also guides us along this. And you could say men and women, ever since the Buddha, they've confirmed the Buddha's findings. So it's not as if really the Buddha represents, you could say, some radical, strange, mystical proposition. It's something that has been confirmed again and again down through the ages. And of course, it's been articulated in different ways. And it's also been approached in different ways in different cultures. Like you have Zen Buddhism, you have Vajrayana Buddhism, you have Vipassana, etc. You have various ways of doing this in different cultures, and they all come with their own particular flavor. But these different styles, they all point to a single objective, which is this insight into the fact that phenomena cannot be grasped. And so in that way, there's a unitary vision really all across the board in the Buddhist teaching. But what also really signifies the Buddhist path is what we call skillful means. And that is that the Buddha adapted his teaching to those to whom he was teaching and sought to provide a way with which individuals could integrate integrate this vision. And that's where we have various methods in the Buddhist teachings. Not as if the Buddha just says, hey, everything's empty, get with the program. The Buddha very kindly proposed various methods. And of course, what's particularly conspicuous and what's, you could say, universal all across the board in the various Buddhist traditions is this practice of meditation. And that is where we actually sit and have the condition for being present, not distracted. And this enables us to really properly see. Otherwise, we're just here. We could hear a lot of teachings and they don't really make sense. But the moment that we sit down and actually settle and allow the mind to be calm, then this makes a lot of sense. And that's where we combine, you could say, the vision and the understanding with actual ways in which we integrate this insight in a deeper degree. And that's where we talk about meditation. The Tibetan word for meditation, interestingly, is gom, which really just means familiarization. So all we're doing with meditation is just familiarizing ourselves with something we've seen. So that's where we need to sort of abandon a little bit the idea of meditation as being becoming absorbed into some deeper trance-like condition in which we're sort of off on a different planet or off in a different dimension. Rather, meditation is on the basis of an insight that we have to just familiarize ourselves with this, essentially allowing the mind to calm down, and also to disengage the normal fixation on the narratives that we're, you could say, addicted to, or certainly very impressed with. So that's where the skillful means of the path consists of methods like meditation, but also ways in which we integrate with the world. And that's where we have the various teachings in terms of behavior. And that's, of course, where Buddhism then, you could say, aligns itself with a lot of aspects of Western psychology, which is very much about behavior. But the thing is, in the Buddhist teachings on, say, non-aggression, compassion, and so forth, it really isn't limited to just behaving in a you could say, aggressive way, but it comes very much from actually understanding the foundation for non-aggression, which is understanding how the perceptions and the projections we have with regards to the world around us, the individuals around us, and so on, they are not necessarily that real. And particularly on the basis of that, the various ways in which we perceive the world on the basis of our perceptions, which then result in we like certain things, we have attachment to certain things, we dislike other things, we have aversion to other things. This actually exists, this constitutes a constant filter in which we're not really relating to our life, we're not really relating to our world, but really just a filtered down, censored version of what we want and what our agenda is. And that's where the practice of non-aggression is actually to begin to extract ourselves a little bit from this rather fussy angle that we have on our life and actually begin to be more open and accepting. So in this way, non-violence is not just some, you could say, some decree that has been issued forth that thou shalt be a good boy and girl and not be aggressive and so forth, but very much comes from an insight into the nature of our reality. So this is just a little bit of opening discussion here. As you know me, this is only 10 minutes into the class. Usually my introductions, they go for up to most of the class. So anyway, we'll have a look at the text itself. And last time let's see here. Last time we were specifically going into this discussion about what do we really mean when we say I. So I'll just read a little bit from the page here, the last paragraph. So when we say I am happy, or I am sad, then the Khenpo points out, although we mean the mind is happy or sad, we do not really make the distinction between ourself and our mind. Nevertheless, we also find ourselves saying things like, I could not control my mind. Incidentally, we also say, I could not control myself, as if one had two selves. So what are we talking about? Is the mind us, or are we the owner of the mind? Do we possess the mind? Could not control myself. There we seem to be saying that this is actually me. So there's a little bit of this is his point really, we're not quite clear. So this seems to be, so the Khenpo says, this seems to be the same lack of clarity that enables us sometimes to talk of the self, talk as if the self were the mind, and sometimes as if the self owned the mind. So that's where we came to last time in the discussion. Let's see here. I'm a little bit multitasking. Let's see. Excuse me. I think we're good. Okay. All right. So then the Khenpo continues. One might be tempted at this point to start speculating about the nature of mind and the self. One might even wax philosophical about it, reflecting on such statements as, I think, therefore I am. This is Descartes' famous cogito, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. And that, of course, is valid in some sense because it gives a sense of existence. So we can't blame old Descartes that this is what he figured. But at the same time, we can look at this statement and really, really ask ourselves, is this really the conclusion we can draw? We could actually say, I think, therefore I'm thinking, not necessarily draw the conclusion I am. We could say I'm perceiving thoughts, I'm having thoughts, and all of that. But like Khenpo then continues here, he says, however, since I am in itself is merely a thought, the only thing we're really sure of is the experience of thought. So drawing the conclusion I am, that's one thing. Or rather, saying I have thoughts, that's one thing. But to then draw the conclusion I am, fair enough, but the point is, and this is where we have the pebble in the shoe, we identify this I as something solid, unchanging, and this is where our suffering comes from. So we are really presently looking, this is not about semantics or sort of, you could say nitpicking, but it's really about the reality is that there's actually nothing that we can identify as a solid self, and this is what we want to get to the bottom of. So the Khenpo says, so the only sure means of finding out what that experience is to experience it as precisely and as dispassionately as is possible. So the Shravaka approach, and here we're referring really to, you could say, the foundational aspects of the Buddhist teaching, is to investigate experience by simply being as aware as possible every moment. And that is then where we're applying this practice of simply observing. So we of course, there's no, you could say nothing wrong about saying I am, I think, therefore I am, because that's only natural. Obviously, we're each having our particular thoughts, and they are the basis for what we attribute to ourselves as being self. But the thing is, self as something solid, unchanging. That's a problem, or rather, that's you could say that's that's an unwarranted conclusion. That's you could say flawed conclusion is really the point. So that's where we investigate, saying, is there really something that is unchanging, something that is solid? And that's where the approach then, like I started off saying, the Buddha says the beauty of what the Buddha's teaching really is that he's just asking us to please have a look, not just say, okay, the Buddha said this, or I'd like to subscribe to this view because this sounds nice, and I'd like to sort of be part of the club that has that particular viewpoint. But really, all the Buddha wants us is to actually have our own genuine insight. So the Khenpo says, in order to carry out this investigation as systematically as possible, Buddhist teachers have organized experience into a number of comprehensive set of categories. One of these sets of categories is called the 5 skandhas, which literally means the 5 heaps. And this is interesting because David Hume, who was a Scottish philosopher in, I think it was 17th century, he also said that you can't really find a self. All you can find is actually, and he used the word heaps. Very interesting. Of course, not that he sort of dabbled in Buddhism at all. I'm not sure there was any sort of traffic between India and Scotland at that time. But it's just interesting to see how you could say this is not necessarily just a Buddhist idea, but it's something really that we can we can identify, and also in terms of our own experience, we can see that we are many different colors, many different things. We're complex, if you like. So they're called heaps because, looked at dispassionately, all our experience arises moment by moment as isolated, impersonal events. After they have arisen, so soon after that it seems simultaneously, we become emotionally involved and create a whole scenario of self versus world or other. Now, this is where it really sort of touches what's happening with us, because we do that. We have a big drama happening around me and what's happening to me in this world, self versus other. And again, where in Western phenomenology, we generally just think, oh, well, there's a self. But here it's different. We actually go in, we analyze, is there actually a self? And that's where we identify this thing that we refer to as our personal identity. This exists in terms of these 5 skandhas. So that's where we have form, feeling, perception, mental constructions, and consciousness. So this actually, what was it? Would have been a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, when we went through Chögyam Trungpa's Glimpses of Abhidharma. That's probably close to 2 years since. I think we started in January 2020. So we have actually, at least in these Monday classes, looked at these before, but there's something we return to again and again. So the first is form. So form refers to the body and the environment. Now, let me just say, if you come to this from the point of view of the great perfection and some of the more, you could say, higher Mahayana teachings, we're very interested in how did we ever misconstrue this, you could say, ground consciousness altogether. And that's where we talk about what we call co-emergent ignorance and co-emergent ignorance and labeling ignorance, which is basically the place where we went wrong, where we just sort of black out. And all of a sudden, where you could say the mind has a natural freedom from self-consciousness, where the mind naturally is open and without this division between self and other. What has happened to us is, like Trungpa says, it's like we were dancing and we got a little bit too, somebody says, oh, you're dancing beautifully. All of a sudden we have the thought, oh, I'm dancing really wonderfully. And then all of a sudden our sort of very free engagement with space all of a sudden is slightly clunky and we are self-conscious. And all of a sudden there's me and the space. And that's where it's a bit like, also Trungpa says, a bit like where we were just a grain of sand. Then all of a sudden one of the little sand sticks its head out and say, I'm a particular, very special grain of sand. And that's where all of a sudden we have the drama around me. Innately, the mind doesn't have this confusion. But there's a place where we have this blackout, where we actually lose sight of our original condition of freedom. And all of a sudden we retreat into this insecurity that says me, and that posits other. And that sense of other, this perpetuates then the drama of me. So that's where we, on the basis of this initial moment of ignorance, co-emergent ignorance, then comes this labeling ignorance, where we begin to more solidly think I, other. And that's where we begin to freeze our experience. That's where we begin to have this experience of self and other. And our relationship to the world from then on is not really an open relationship. It's a continual strategizing in terms of us versus a frozen world of our projections. That's really the Buddha's point. But what we're looking at now then is, once this has happened and we have this self, then we begin to think I, and with that I then comes this private experience of I, my identity, and the sense of embodiment. And that's where I begins to experience and have a sense of I in terms of a body, and you could say an embodied sense of self versus the projections onto the realm in which we are. And that's where we continually engage in a condition of conscious perceptions, the relationship between I and my perceptions. This, of course, you can take it or leave it, but that's generally how the Buddhists, they explain how did we get here. And that's where you then, on the basis of this, you could say complexity, also find there's nothing really that has any inherent existence, and it is essentially just a continual play of causes and conditions. But this is the condition of delusion that we're in right now. It comes about from the basis of this initial moment of ignorance. And while we could say this happened 50,000 lifetimes ago, the point is really that it happens every micro moment. So it's something that we can get to. That, of course, is what the Buddha is intending in the whole teaching on prajna, the teachings on meditation, and the teachings on beginning to have insight, beginning to see, is really based on the ability that our intelligence has to see through this condition. But what we do now is we look at the way in which we then operate with this self. And that's where we see this so-called self that we have in relation to the world, but the sense of I, solid, form, etc. That is just one part of the package. And the package consists of these 5 elements, namely this experience of form, the self and the other, and then on the basis of that, feeling. I like, I don't like, very binary. Or actually, we usually would say there's 3 emotions, like, not like, and neutral. And then we begin to weave narratives on the basis of that. This leads then to particular impulses, particular, you could say, emotional experiences with relation to our world. And this is then held together by just a general sense of I, you could say, situated within this reality. So that's why we have these 5 skandhas. Now, presently, just at this level, we're really just identifying these 5 and how they seem to function in terms of our immediate experience. So the Khenpo says form refers to the body and the environment. We take for granted that there is a world out there beyond our senses and that our body partakes of that world. When we sit down to meditate, it is the body and its environment that first catch our attention. So we can start our investigation there. I am sitting here because my body is sitting here. Is that I, therefore the body? Yeah. I sit, therefore I am. Now, does that apply? So the Khenpo says one can examine the body systematically, taking it limb by limb, organ by organ. Is my hand me? Am I still me without my hand? What is a hand anyway? Is it still a hand without fingers, without skin, without bone, without flesh? When it is broken down in this way, one finds that hand is merely a convenient concept. There is no such thing as a hand as such. It is the same for every part of the body. It's the same right down to the tiniest cell and the tiniest atom and the tiniest part of an atom, as scientists know only too well. However far one investigates, one will always find more parts, and each part is given a name. Each part will be found to break up into something other than itself. The process is endless. So that's what we're encouraged to do here. And this is, like last time, I was referring to this piece that we had to read in high school by a Danish author, Peter Seeberg, who essentially was telling this sort of, it's sort of a cute story really about a guy who has all his body parts replaced. And all along, his wife is reassuring him she still loves him. He's still the same man. Finally, he has the head replaced. And the doctors and the wife, they all reassure him that it's still him. Obviously, he has a little bit of identity crisis happening. But this is so interesting because you can almost visualize that experience. I can very well experience getting all of a sudden, the story of Ganesh, right? There's Shiva babysitting. Parvati's gone out. Shiva's babysitting the kid. Something goes wrong and the kid loses its head. So what? Don't leave the fathers alone with the kids, right? So I think Shiva has some intuition that the first being that he meets on the road will be the right one to replace the kid's head. So he goes out, meets an elephant, has no choice, cuts off the elephant's head, plonks it on the kid. Parvati comes home, and there's Ganesh. So that's, but you know, probably the kid would still have the sense of, this is me. And we still, and we of course also in the context of brain plasticity and so on, we have all these sort of phenomena about people who've lost their arm, but they still have the experience of pain in the arm. So there's these curious phenomena where we can see this is the whole idea of our body is so much tied up with our concepts. And again, the basis for that imputation, the body as such, as something solid, again is made up of parts, and we can endlessly break this down. Examining the body in this way, one may come to the conclusion that I and body are merely convenient concepts for dealing with the world and experience. They have a certain relative reality, but they are not absolutes. And this is important. Ladies and gentlemen, we're not saying there's no body, okay? There's none of that. We still have our body, and for all practical purpose, we still say, I am Jakob, and I am thinking, by the way, and I have a body and a hand. But what we're addressing here is this notion of it being something absolute. And that's where the more we realize that these are not absolutes, then, okay, yeah, well, you know, what was it again? Some of the old, what were they called? The Stoics, right? So there was, I think, one guy called Epictet, you know, had him on the rack. And they had sort of broken one bone after the other, and they were onto his legs. And they say, what do you feel now? He says, well, you know, if you keep going like that, you'll probably break my leg. But that kind of, you could say, dispassionate lack of detachment actually provides for tremendous openness. You might not be able to do anything about circumstances. And that's where, yes, you might lose your hand, you might not get the things that we want, but the problem is we attribute absolute values to some of these things. And the less we do that, the more we're actually in tune with reality, even though the reality certainly might not be ideal. So that's where the issue of the two truths continually plays in. Are we attributing solidity in an absolute sense or not? And the only thing the Buddha wants to say, the Buddha's not in there when you're watching the movie saying there's no movie. The Buddha is just saying it's just a movie. So that's where, of course, we have experience. But the attribution of absolute, that's where you could say the problem lies. So the Khenpo says, in the relative truth, in the truth as we perceive it, they are streams of events that one identifies and labels as I or body. But that I or body cannot be said to have permanent, unitary, or independent existence. And this is really the three terms that we continually are challenging. The idea of this permanent self, a unitary self, an independent self. That's where we can see that we change. We're not permanent. We can see that we are not unitary for the mere fact that we're both mind and body, and then we're within mind and body, each of these have a zillion components. And independent, there's also not something that is independent. Everything is dependent on the conditions that really create this sense of self. So Khenpo says, if the body had such existence, it might have been called the self, but it does not have. And however much one were to investigate, it never would have. It is not self, and self is not the body. The same applies for the brain, of course. Okay, and that's sort of generally where we get into sort of the discussion about the Western perception, which of course is very justified. And again, that comes back to simply relative truth. There's definitely a lot happening with our brain. And the moment that our brain is not functioning, well, this definitely affects us. Just like also it affects us when we lose parts of the body. But in terms of our, you could say, cognitive capacity, the brain is definitely a key element of our experience of self. But we would never, in the Buddhist teaching, we would never attribute absolute existence to the brain. We would never attribute absolute existence to something that is essentially matter. So that's the first skandha of form, the body. Second one, feeling, vedana, sarva. So feeling here refers specifically to those of pleasure, displeasure, and indifference. Actually, I should say, let me just see if there's any questions about these things. Any questions here? Peter, what do you say?
It's all pretty clear so far.
Huh?
It's pretty clear so far.
It's pretty clear, okay. Then there's paradox of the heap in Western philosophy is about where to draw a line between concepts. Okay, all right. You'll have to elaborate on that at one point, but I'll take your word for it. But the point here is, and that of course is probably where there wouldn't really be a disagreement, even though they might employ the concept of the heap in different contexts in Western philosophy. What we're talking about here is more the complexity of it. But I'm sure there would be a place where these two actually would agree. But anyway, as I listen and contemplate these teachings about non-self, I find myself feeling a tender spark of deep happiness. But then there is this flicker of doubt that cuts this. Not sure if it is habitual protection or wisdom pointing out the need to investigate through more practice. This is good. How did these teachings reveal themselves to you non-conceptually? Tanya. Okay. Well, look, that's really good. And you know, sometimes there is in the teachings on emptiness, there's the Buddha who at one point says, the Buddha says, whoever hears the teachings on emptiness and has this experience of like the hairs on their body standing on end with joy, that's those persons to whom one should teach emptiness. But there's also those for whom it could be deeply disconcerting, very destabilizing. So that's how we generally talk about it. Tolstoy, he makes a point really that we shouldn't worry too much about it, because you'd have to be very sensitive and in a way a very high level meditator to really be destabilized by these teachings, in the sense that this, you could say, introduction to the space and the expanse of no self could seem very, could really come across in a very experiential way that could be quite shocking. But for most of us, we just hear this and it's more an inspiration for us just to look deeper. And so that's where I would say, first of all, the first thing is good, the spark of deep happiness, and then also the second part is good too. I would say the first is actually, you could say, almost first thought, best thought, because that is where you could take this into the dimension of practice right away. But the fact that we have second thoughts is pretty indicative of the fact that we have what we would call doubt. And that's actually where we need to make the doubt work for us. Because doubt is actually not so bad, because that's where we, on the basis of critical thinking, we arrive at certainty. So we could have that sort of sense of just being deeply happy and going into a space of unconditional freedom from self. But then it might just be a little bit of a romantic, fleeting experience, and we might come back. There might be impermanent, and that's where we need to have the sort of the hard intelligence that applies on a rainy day, and that's where we need to actually continue investigating and continually inquiring. So that's where I'm at. And so if you ask me, how did these teachings reveal themselves to you non-conceptually? I would say I'm still a work in progress, but so far it makes sense. So I actually use this to be confident when I practice shamatha, and shamatha vipassana, if you like, to leave the mind without following after the ordinary conceptions, actually provides a space that's very comfortable. And that's where I have the confidence in that, saying, okay, this is okay to do, because fixating on the arising of the thoughts, I've already established that that is actually where the solidity takes place, and the notion of self begins to sort of gel. So that really happens on the basis of being unconscious. But the moment that I'm a little bit mindful and conscious, then there's a space that actually is not caught up with these projections and these narratives. So that's where this investigation here, you could say, leaves me comfortable to just let the mind settle. Otherwise, I could sort of come back and say, oh yeah, I'm feeling comfortable, but. And that's where the what we call establishing the view is quite helpful in terms of facilitating then the further practice of meditation. But anyway, so that's how I use it. But that being said, there is something so provocative about this that it never ceases actually to have a little bit of grip on us. You know, we by default would say, I do exist. I think, therefore I am. I am here and you are there. And that's where this never really ceases to have its sort of, you could say, it never gets bland. It never becomes just a truism that you just say, okay, it's all empty or whatever. It's very much something that exists as provocative because we habitually, and this actually goes all the way up, we would say almost to the 10th bhumi of the bodhisattvas. There is this notion of perception, reference point, and so on. So this whole investigation doesn't ever actually sort of just fade into just routine. It always has an edge on us because we're always actually confronted with this fixating on itself. So it doesn't get dull. Peter?
I'm just thinking of that there Bourget's 3 vital points, where someone has to show you a powerful experience of the truth of your true nature, and you actually taste it.
Yes.
And then you have to cultivate an appreciation, a love of that, and then little by little, maybe you can start to make choices in life that support that to work more.
Right. So bringing in the, and this we'll actually get to later, but bringing in the end of the book here, which is the perspective of what we call Greater Madhyamaka. We have in that tradition something called the Great Perfection Teaching, or Hatha Yoga, which notably came down from Garab Dorje. And Garab Dorje, his approach, but this was also according to, you could say, those who were able to sort of have this immediate experience, was actually his approach was to introduce that space in which there is before confusion, and then encourage the students to stick with that. So that of course is valid. So the question is about this. But that, again, in some way, it's very helpful. So the question is, how about the 3 words of Garab Dorje and introducing just this nature?
But also the non-conceptual experience. She's asking
Yeah.
about non-conceptual, and that's the way to have, wow, this is
Yeah.
an experience.
So yes, so in the case of Garab Dorje and Peter, there is this there's this non-conceptual experience, which is absolutely valid. And the only problem that could come up is then when we begin to question the experience. And that's where having a solid foundation in the, you could say, the dialectical and intellectual, the rational aspect of things is very helpful. Then you have, you could say, no doubt. Our conscientious grain of sand could be very helpful, though. If we don't allow it to fool us, we could transform ourselves into wonderful dancers with great spatial awareness and understanding of others. Absolutely, that's what actually the Buddha wants us to do. So yes, by all means. Or am I too optimistic about the responsibility of my ego? But you see, that's actually not the ego. The ego is what doesn't dance. The dancing capacity is the freedom from ego. So ego is what holds us back. So what really the Buddha would just want us to do is ease us out of this sort of momentary, you could say, this momentary condition of fixating the insecurity of the self. That's all we're doing. But we definitely We could transform ourselves into wonderful dancers, and the Buddha's point is that we are wonderful dancers. There's nothing lacking, and it's a bit like if somebody was a wonderful dancer and then had amnesia. Then actually they might all of a sudden, just even though they couldn't remember anything about the technique, they might just all of a sudden the body just might snap into it and they might just sort of get with it again. So that's where all the various teachings we have from the Buddha is really about that. If it's non-conceptual, would we even have the words to describe our experience? No. And that's why we would always say the wisdom nature that we're describing here is not the scope of the ordinary intellect. This is famously from Shantideva. And it is something that is beyond language, it's beyond thought, it's beyond any form of description. So what we're doing presently is actually not pointing it out, saying, this is how the non-conceptual is. We're simply just identifying that there's nothing we can grasp onto. The non-conceptual itself is not something that we can objectify or conceptualize. Okay, good. Feeling. So feeling here refers specifically to those of pleasure, displeasure, and indifference. For example, as one sits in meditation, one might like it and want to stay, or one may not and want to leave. The only other alternative is that one may not care one way or the other. That's where we go, whatever. Wherever we are and whatever we're doing, we're always experiencing one or other of these three feelings. They are not self, however, because none of them is lasting. They take turns in arising. So we have this, I like this, and I don't like this. And that moment of experience of my displeasure doesn't amount to a self. It amounts to a moment of displeasure, but to say it's self, that's something that we add to it, and particularly to attribute a solidity to this. That's something that we're adding onto it. What we really have is this moments of experience, moments of consciousness. So as the Khenpo says, they take turn in arising. Now there is happiness, now sadness, and so on. Self could not be the feelings because they are always changing. So this is the second skanda, Vedana, and that's really where we begin to solidify our experience of space. We've already have a sense of self, other, but with the sense of like, dislike, it already begins to take on a greater, you could say, reality. So one thing is that we are entering into a space and we're kind of open, but then I like it, I don't like it. Then already begins to have this sense of me, and there's sort of already a sort of tension between the space and oneself. So we might initially, we come into a space where we've never been before, maybe into a room with some people. So that we could come in completely, well, let's imagine we come in completely non-judgmental, right? We're not predisposed in any way. But then all of a sudden there's something that sparks, like dislike, or maybe we're just like, couldn't care less. But then there's a like and dislike. And what happens then? There's all of a sudden there's this much more vivid sense of self versus the other. So that's where self begins to build up. Now the third one is then we begin to have perceptions. That's where we begin to then weave narratives. I feel uncomfortable because, and then we begin to, have stories. Perception. Perception here refers to the first moment of recognition of input through the senses. When one experiences a color such as blue, one recognizes it as blue. When one feels an itch, one recognizes the feeling. Or when one hears a car starting up, one recognizes the sound, and the same applies to smells, etc. Basically all the senses, including also our thoughts. We experience a continual stream of perceptions through our senses. We experience a continual stream of perceptions through our senses all the time we are awake. We are either listening to something, looking at something, feeling something with our sense of touch, tasting or smelling something, or even receiving the image of something arising in the mind. We have 6 senses, including the mind. As one sits in meditation, one might be perceiving the breath moving in and out, images floating into the mind, or noises going out in the street outside, and so on. Although one thinks it is oneself that is perceiving these things, one does not think these perceptions are the self. None of them has the characteristics of self, since none of them is lasting. So again, here the point very much is again identifying that there's not a unitary, permanent, unconditional self. There's various perceptions. The more primitive kind we just looked at was the sense of like, dislike, or neutral. And now we're beginning to sort of have more of a story in terms of our various perceptions. So then we have mental constructions, samskaras, or duche. And the previous ones, the Sanskrit, what is it again? Samjana, and in Tibetan, duche. So mental constructions, this is where we begin to have what we call mental factors, these 51 mental factors that that we have in the Abhidharma teachings. It's also here very much where you could say the Abhidharma teachings are about these various mental events. So mental constructions include all the mental activity of thinking, patterns of thought, negative emotions such as desire, pride, and jealousy, and healthy emotions such as love, devotions, and patience. So we have all these mental things that happen to us. There's, like I said, there's 51. Some of them are good, some of them are negative, but they're essentially, you could say, things that happen to us, we experience, and we are aware of them. It's very much that place where the question, how are you, goes. Yep, I have, I'm feeling this, that, or the other. Of course, in conventional language, we sort of don't go too much into detail, but incidentally, we would actually know if we were to sit down on the basis of our own introspection and analyze what do I feel right now, we would actually know. So that is where we could have something that has nothing to do with something mystical, but something that is actually verifiable. We would know what we're experiencing. So the Khenpo then says, in fact, feelings and perceptions are mental constructions too, but for the sake of this categorization, they're here listed separately. So that's where you could say, yes, the feelings, like, dislike, and all of that, that of course also is in some sense mental constructions. Mental constructions there, they come at the end of us having first had the likes and dislikes and beginning to have a more sort of sophisticated, centralized sense of our reality. And that's where we then operate from in the case of the skandha of the mental constructions. The term in Sanskrit for this heap, in Sanskrit we say skandha for these 5 heaps, is samskara or duche. Samskara also has the meaning of predisposition in the sense of tracks left by former deeds that conditions one's present thinking and behavior. So this is where also we would say when we talk about the 12 links of dependent arising, then the duche is the second one. First, we have the initial ignorance. We come into this life on the basis of our particular ignorance, and then immediately we're actually driven by seeds that are laid down on our all ground that begins to take place already the moment that we enter into the moment of conception, really. And even at the time of being in the womb, and of course, up through our age, our motoric skills aren't developed. Particularly, actually, mammals are particularly slow. Among all the, isn't that right, Peter? I think among all the sort of various animals, the human is particularly slow, right?
There's a lot of brain development that has to happen after birth to get through the canal, and so there's a lot of wiring.
Oh, okay. Due to that, yeah, because of the brain, yeah. Okay. But so then there is, we would say there is predispositions that shape these particular developments. So the Tibetan term duche is a general term meaning mental constructions of any kind. Although we should understand that everything that arises in the mind is conditioned by what has gone before, in general, we can just take this skandha to mean all mental events, not included the other three mental skandhas. So essentially up to here, then we have, you could say, the raw material for our person. Then what we're going to look at next is the skandha of consciousness that really holds all of this together. So the Khenpo says, although we do not think of mental constructions or mental events as being self, we do tend to identify ourselves with what we conceive to be our personality. Emotionally, if some part of our personality is criticized, we feel we ourselves has been criticized. However, if one examines the makeup of one's personality very carefully and dispassionately, we find it even more intangible than the body. So that's where we attribute, strangely, we attribute something to this body. You know, somebody says, Jakob, you're losing your hair and you're going gray and you're full of wrinkles. And I go, what? I'm barely 25, you know, etc. That's where we identify with body. And then somebody will say, gosh, you're such a grumpy bastard. And I go, me? You know, etc. So we have a dimension of body, we have a dimension of mind, but what actually we attribute, which is in excess, is this whole thing of me. And that's where we lose our cool. Somebody gets insulted and they'll just sort of shrug their shoulders and says, well, that's your problem. And we go, yeah, cool. Somebody gets all worked up because somebody get a little insult, you know, and we can see this poor person is losing their cool. And we can actually see the delusion and the suffering in this. And it's why we actually can sympathize with that is because we intuitively appreciate that it's actually unnecessary. And that's why we say when somebody is sort of easy and detached, we actually go, yeah, that's cool. That's you know, we're not suggesting people become doormats and you know, martyrs of anything. That's not it. But it's just that we can actually see the pain that lies in this attribution of solidity. So that's where this analysis really is interesting in terms of both in terms of the body, but also now particularly in terms of the mind. We actually cannot find anything there that constitutes a self. So the Khenpo says, at least with the body, one was sure what was included as part of it, even though none of it could be identified as a self. So that's, you could say, tangible. Now we're in this sort of vacuous, intangible realm of the mind. That's where he says, with one's personality, on the other hand, one just has a stream of ever-changing mental constructions and events. One tends to choose certain more or less constant features of this stream as characteristics of a particular personality. And when they manifest, one feels a person is being himself. So that's why this could actually become an addiction. We might say, well, this is how I am. And we in some way, there's a little bit of fear of the space in no self. And that's where even though we're suffering, we might actually insist on holding on to this sense of self. So that's where we have this sense a person feels a certain solidity of being him or herself. If they start to manifest, again, in a more or less constant fashion, totally different characteristics from before, we talk about him or her having had a change of personality. All of a sudden, somebody's completely different, right? And then we think, who is this? And of course, also people individually have that. So the Khenpo says, we talk of people not being in their right mind, of being temporarily deranged, and so on. The implication is that there is a person or self other than the present personality or mind state. It is this self that we are investigating. You know, instead people say, "Oh, you're not really yourself." You know, now I feel I'm back to being myself. So the Khenpo says it's clearly not the personality or any of the mental constructions or events that constitute it, since none of them exhibit a permanent, unitary, and independent element that one could call the self. So this doesn't really mean that all of a sudden hearing this we become selfless, but it's intended to sort of instill a little bit of a questioning with regards to the solidity that we attribute to the self. And it does justify the fact of not taking ourselves too seriously, and particularly in the practice of meditation. Then this is where we actually, you could say, justify the practice of when thoughts arise, just label them thoughts and let them be. There's not the ordinary habitual inclination to be, you could say, stubbornly married to the project of me and my sort of my particular likes and dislikes. So we'll stop here. Next time we'll continue with the fifth skandha, consciousness. Let's see if there's some questions. When you've never tasted salt, someone needs to give you sugar first and tell you that's not it. Sans Jamgön Kongtrul Lodrötaye. Is he talking about non-conceptuality? Yeah, because he's talking about where we can't actually put our finger on something, and all we can say it's not this. And that's in fact what we're doing here. We're not introducing saying the experience of selflessness is like this. That we're not saying. But what we are saying is that can we find a self? And we look and we look and we look. So that's where in the Mahamudra tradition particularly they say, oh, the great finding or the great discovery of not finding anything. So that's what Thomas Aquinas Rinpoche is on about. We can really just identify it in terms of what it's not. Do we not also experience perceptions when sleeping? I usually can hear surrounding sounds when sleeping and sometimes feeling. That's right. Yeah, it's interesting. The Khenpo was saying when we're awake, because of course we had the same thing happening when we're sleeping. So yes, I agree with you. Yeah, we definitely experience perceptions when we're sleeping. Okay, leave it at that. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may it defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Thank you. We'll have a 2-minute or 3-minute break, and then we'll begin the next part of the program. Awesome. So welcome to the second component of the program, which is just a little bit about meditation practice. And I think most of you are familiar with Buddhist meditation, but at the same time, it's probably good to go over what we're doing. And sometimes it's quite helpful to actually be reminded. I very much would like to line everything that we're doing in terms of meditation up with the discussions that we had before that. So we don't have the sort of idea that there's Buddhist theory here and then there's Buddhist practice there. The point with the theory is really to gain an awareness and a certainty about what we're given, what are our given conditions. And meditation is really drawn from the conclusion that our mind spins off into delusional projections and fixates. And where we very often have these sort of fridge magnet cliches that would say things like, well, just let it go and just do this and just do that. They're very often sort of annoyingly simplistic, really. And that's where the Buddha very kindly accommodates the fact that we don't just all of a sudden get with the program. We don't all of a sudden just let things go. Even though, yes, we can let things go, and there's a strong case to be made for that. Nevertheless, most of us, it's not that easy, and that's where we need the ideal conditions. So it's never as if meditation is something about escaping into a particular comfort zone or a particular alternative dimension in which there are no problems, but it's more us beginning to understand the transparency and the workability of our problems. We give ourselves the best conditions to not fixate the way that we ordinarily do. So there's an incredible pragmatic spirit behind the practice of meditation, and also really a very compassionate attitude in terms of just understanding that it's not that easy, and we need to give ourselves the best chance, really. So, but it does come from the place of recognizing that we're never going to think our way out of it. And meditation is, yes, we can say it's non-conceptual, but it's founded on some profound insights into the flaws of our conceptuality. So it's not really as if we just sit down and sort of go, okay, now I'm not going to have any thoughts. It's more that we can see where it is that we're being sort of led by the nose by our thinking. And we're not really struggling with our thinking. We're just not giving them the power that they ordinarily have. We're not submitting to thoughts the way that we ordinarily do. They don't become the great dictators or the great VIPs in our lives in which I'm thinking this and now that thought is awful and I don't want it. Because that's where we're actually giving it tremendous authority. And you can say the practice of meditation is in a way that we all of a sudden actually say, sorry, but I'm out of here. I'm not necessarily going to be falling for this again and again and again. So there's a spirit of, if you like, rebellion. There's a spirit of autonomy. There's a spirit of actually we could do perfectly well, actually beginning to connect with reality without this constant, ongoing drone of our subjective interpretations, our thoughts and our attitudes and our sort of general just mindlessness. The thing is, these are not really enemies, but they're really just products of a long habit of mindlessness. And all we're doing now is just introducing a dimension of being present. It's not something that's new to us. Very often when we have to step up, we might be, for example, sort of have just had a terrible argument with somebody, and then we have to go in and maybe do a presentation. And we actually cannot just indulge in saying, well, I just had an argument, I can't do this. We could choose, but sometimes we just end up doing it. And it's interesting because the moment that we actually do that, we're actually far better off. We come out of having to done that presentation, and we can barely remember what that argument was about. So that's where there's an incredible power in the sustaining and hanging in and perpetuating particular narratives. And there's tremendous power when we actually just let it go. And it doesn't at all have anything to do with glossing over or sweeping it under the carpet or suppressing. It's really just a question of beginning to have a perspective in which we can see you can say how thoughts are overrated, how we unnecessarily kowtow to our thoughts. It doesn't mean that we don't have thoughts. It doesn't mean that we should demonize thoughts or say thoughts are terrible and all of that. We have thoughts, and thoughts really just, they arise out of the power of the mind. It's actually the creative power of the mind. So there's nothing wrong with the ability to reflect. There's nothing. We can also see thoughts when they're not contaminated by a lot of bog, a lot of sort of heaviness, then they're very often surprisingly brilliant. So very often we find that our insights and brilliance doesn't come when we've been thinking and thinking and thinking. Very much comes out of the blue. It just comes when there's lack of thinking. So that's why we have to make a case for meditation really in terms of us freeing ourselves from an unnecessary burden. And that's where meditation, again, is not about going into a particular state, but it's much more just about giving ourselves a breathing space. So in that way, meditation is something that's definitely aligned with us coming into touch with reality, not so much removing ourselves from it. So there's two aspects to meditation, and I'll go over this very briefly because this probably many of you have heard so many times. But there's shamatha and vipassana, calm abiding and insight. Calm abiding is enabling non-distraction. Insight is what grows out of that. And that's where insight, vipassana, sometimes is helped by, like the study we just did, you can say an insight that we might have. We might see how, in fact, we are unnecessarily subject to our fixating on a self. We might be unnecessarily subject to impulses that are clearly destructive. We might be habituated to anger. We might be habituated to just indulging our slightest desire. We might be habituated to all sorts of things. And that's where we discover that we needn't actually be subject to these impulses. But one thing is then to be aware of that. The other is to actually begin to free ourselves of it. So this insight that we have needs necessarily to be given a space in which this can actually sink in. So that's where we can have a lot of great sort of personal growth books and all sorts of fantastic ideas and so on, where what we really need is also a peace of mind in which these insights, they can really take root within our being, enable us to actually open up properly. So initially we talk about vipassana in terms of what we call analysis, analytical meditation, but then we proceed on the basis of that, to proceed in a non-conceptual way to actually just experience, not fixating on the various arisings in the mind. So that's why at that point then, what we call shamatha and vipassana, calm abiding and insight, they begin increasingly to fuse. But as we practice it here, there's three aspects to the technique. One is the body, which is the conspicuous aspect of grounding ourselves in our physical experience. So we sit, and that's where there's some postures that are quite helpful, which is above all, keeping the spine straight. We don't have to sit on the floor. Sitting on a chair is absolutely fine. But the main thing really is that there's a sort of a perky, upbeat body language, that we actually project wakefulness with our body. So that's where we keep a straight spine. We can also take the shoulders a little bit back. We would say to take the chin in a bit, hands on our knees, hands in our lap, however suits us, jaw relaxed. And then without closing the eyes, just lowering the gaze. When the gaze is lowered, there's less distraction. And with that physical posture, then we commit to that for a certain time. And this is not just about locking ourselves in, but it's more really to give our breaking a habit of being fidgety and restless and so on. To actually be able to sit properly has tremendous value, not just in terms of our you could say yogic experience of having a blissful body, but it also has a big impact on the mind. There's very much a strong sense of calm and psychologically if we can actually sit quietly. So we do this without being too rigid about it. If we need to move, then we can adjust. And it's more about just us grounding ourselves and providing the ideal conditions for not being distracted simply through having a calm body. The next aspect is then the ordinarily rather mindless consciousness that's usually just following after one thought after the other. And here we bring the mind back to where we are, which is actually not difficult because we are where we are. There's nothing really that needs to be achieved with it. It's not as if we have to go into a particular dimension of incredible focus. It's more that we are right here, and what we tend to do is sort of absent ourselves. And so the traditional image is, you know, out when the sailors went to sea, they would have a bird with them, and when the bird would bring back a little twig, they'd know they'd be close to land. But meanwhile, out on the ocean, the bird might sort of fly far around, but it will always come back to the ship. And so similarly also, however far our mind might go astray, it always comes back to the mind. But the thing is, us bringing the mind back, it's never a question of actually imposing anything draconian or you could say excessive on the mind, because we are actually here. And what happens is we're just distracted. So all we're doing with the exercise of bringing the mind back is really just discontinuing and being distracted. So it's like, you know, like with ourselves, you know, when we have to focus, we tell ourselves, okay, focus, you know, or somebody else is sort of, and when we say focus, it just means to be here. Or if somebody's completely absent-minded, you know, while they're doing dangerous things, they, you know, we have somebody's handling dangerous, heavy machinery, and you can see they're thinking about all sorts of other things. They're sort of wielding chainsaws while they're sort of having a passionate discussion about something, you know. And then we say, hey, hold it, you know, focus on what you're doing. So that's actually just bringing us back to where we are. It's not really imposing anything new or alien or foreign. So that's where the second aspect has to do with just bringing the mind back in the sense of not being distracted. So that's where we have a reference point. And that's where mindfulness operates, with having a reference point of the breath. So we come back, in this case, we just come back to awareness of the breath. And particularly then here in this tradition, we focus on the out breath, simply because that connects us with what we might perceive as the other. And it also connects us with spaciousness. So it's where we begin to actually relax into where we are. We don't retreat into ourselves. We merge with where we are, the environment, the space, the other, if you like. So that's where there's more focus on the out breath, and we would pay attention as the out breath exits, as it fuses with space, and then we would just relax and allow a gap. But as we're doing this, and then the in-breath happens, and again, we're focused on the out-breath. Now, normally what happens with us is, this is rather important, we get lost in thought. And try and notice a person that's lost in thought. They'll be sitting like this. So much is happening in there. And then if it's your friend, you can go and say, hello, planet Earth calling, hello, sort of like that. They come back, you're back. And that breaks the stream of thought. Now, this is very interesting because let's say that we're ruminating, we're having some negative thoughts, and then somebody calls us on the phone and tells us a joke. Again, like before, we barely remember what it was we were on about when we come off the phone. It breaks something. And it's not that we need to actually create a particular space, but what we need to do is sustain a presence where we're ordinarily just going absent. We absent ourselves. So that's where we get caught into all these narratives, and they like suck us in. So and we're kind of just gullibly sort of going along. They get traction. So that's where what we're doing with coming back to the breath is coming back to something that takes us out of our heads, out of our thinking. Just like somebody who then tells us a joke, or just like if we're handling some heavy machinery or something, we're attentive out of our heads. So despite what meditation looks like, it takes us out of our heads. So that's the beauty of this. So when we're talking about shamatha, we're not necessarily thinking about in terms of going into a particular sustained focus, but we're rather just not going along with the ordinary distraction. And that enables a tremendous freedom from our thoughts. It's not that we're demonizing thoughts, but it's just that we get so carried up in our thoughts when there's nothing really to get us out of our heads. So that's where very often, we have the whole idea that manual labor is pretty good. Working in the garden is kind of good for the mind, and all these kind of things. And very often we find people who do manual labor have, in a way, a sort of a wisdom where very often you have persons who work with very cerebral aspects, or work with knowledge and so on, get rather complicated. So of course, this doesn't necessarily have to be the case, and it doesn't have to be something we stereotypify, but it nevertheless is something we should examine in terms of our own experience. How actually, what get us caught? When is it we get caught up in thoughts, and when is it we get out? And that's where we could see the value of the practice of mindfulness in terms of coming back just to a simple awareness of the breath, very precise. And that's where meditation, despite what it might look like, it's nothing vague. It's something where the great sage Jigme Lingpe says we should really be like somebody who's threading a needle. We're quite onto what we're doing, quite precise. And us being aware of the out-breath is very helpful. So in that way, as we're sitting, we are aware of the out-breath, and then relax. Gap, in-breath happens, again, awareness of the out-breath. And that awareness of the out-breath, that is what we're doing. So really, there's only two things that we're doing in terms of doing, which is we're sitting quietly and we're focusing the mind on the out-breath. That's what we're doing. So if anybody asks you what you're doing when you're meditating, please disappoint them. Please don't say anything about you going into a sublime, serene space or anything. You're just doing something really embarrassingly simple. I sit and I watch my breath. Oh, yeah, well, have a good time. So, perfect. Now, then there's about the not doing, and that's where we we ordinarily, again, mindlessly get entangled in our thoughts and our projections. And with the Vipassana, in terms of analysis and you could say the teachings that we look at, teachings on emptiness and Vipassana, insight, what have you, that's really just they really serve as a critique about the assumptions that we ordinarily have, the way we solidify phenomena. And that's where actually just allowing the mind to not get entangled in the ordinary processes of solidifying and fascination and fixation and rumination, what have you, then we have that insight that justifies this. But then in terms of the practice, it's really just about, as thoughts arise, and us being privy and aware of the thoughts that arise, to not fixate on them. So as thoughts arise, we just come back to the breath. But in terms of the thoughts themselves, the third aspect is really just to not have any particular opinion about the thoughts. We don't need to analyze them. We don't need to evaluate or in any way actually allow them to gain some sort of traction in terms of our attention. This thought, or this thought, nice, that kind of where we the thoughts, they get tractions on us. They're like, the usual with the hook and us biting naively. So that's where we have the choice here to sustain presence. And at that point, well, focus is being on the breath. Yet when thoughts arise, it's not as if we're like, haha, now I have a way to deal with you thoughts. I'm going back to the breath. That's sort of like, you could say, I've found a way to get away from my thoughts. That's not it either. there's a very, you could say, non-aggressive attitude that just thoughts are there, they're welcome to be there, there's plenty of space. And that's where we have the traditional images of clouds in space. The space is not worried about the clouds, and the space is not particularly judgmental about whether the clouds are black or if they're white. So this is how we meditate, really, with these three aspects in terms of our body, our awareness on the breath, and then finally with regards to thoughts, simply just labeling them, thinking whatever they might be, and sustaining presence where the breath is helpful, and just being aware that, yes, thoughts come, but we don't necessarily have to tag along with them. So that's how we would meditate. But what we do when we meditate is that we precede this with, first of all, an awareness that this is something that universally afflicts everyone. So this is not just that we're doing a little private nirvana project, but it's more just that we understand this is what afflicts everyone everywhere. And so us gaining experience in this field really constitutes something, a remedy for what is such an affliction universally. So that's where the attitude that we bring to meditation, rather than being one like, I'm going to get away from everything, it's more like, I'm going to get to the bottom of everything. I want to get to the bottom of what drives suffering universally. And this is when we talk about bodhicitta. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime. That's actually that kind of attitude where we're thinking, may I be of help to others? May I gain some insight that could be useful for others? And that, if we bring that to the meditation practice, it's a very different space than if we're like, oh, I'd really like to achieve some peace of mind, because that's where we're a little bit sort of frail and fragile, and rather if we have that sense that I'm going to look into something that could benefit others, there's a much more powerful and a much more empowered place where we actually see ourselves as actually having a tremendous purpose in terms of serving others. Then while we're doing the practice, we would generally say not to judge what's happening, not to have reference points, not to sort of give, you could say, evaluation of what's happening, just simply practicing. And then at the end, when we conclude, whatever good there is, we give it away. So this we call dedication. And that's also where we sometimes also we dedicate whatever good there was to others, but we also make aspirations. May I, progress along the path. So in this particular context here, then, we use a liturgy that creates a particular atmosphere. We invoke the Buddha, not as an external savior, but really as somebody who discovered this potential that we naturally have, and yet which remains veiled in us. So we can think of the Buddha, we can think of the Dalai Lama, we can think of our teacher in one way or another, but the main thing is really that we create an atmosphere in which there's tremendous appreciation for this quality, because having understood how valuable this is, then we really can't overestimate this enough. And the liturgy that we chant very much reflects that. It's very much the language of bhakti, devotion, and a language of profound respect for what the Buddha discovered. So of course, from the sort of modern or even postmodern sort of idea that there's no such a thing as truth, there's no such a thing as some sort of something greater, then nevertheless, within our experience, then there is definitely a sort of a qualitative difference between ourselves and the Dalai Lama. There's sort of a qualitative difference between us being entangled in confusion and not being entangled in confusion. And generally, there's a particularly warm feeling that comes by sustaining this kind of visualization or presence of the Buddha. So that's really the framework then for meditation. Then at one point we relinquish the reference of the Buddha and simply just settling into meditation quite simply. We do this through sitting for 15 minutes, doing 15 minutes of mindful walking, and then again sitting for 15 minutes. And then at the end, then we dedicate. Then we pray, may all beings become like the Buddha, and also we make some aspirations on the path. So that's the program, and we'll just again take 2-minute break and then we'll begin. Thank you very much. So, just reading from the italics here. In the Samadhi Sutra, it said, those who while walking, sitting, sleeping, or standing recollect the moon-like Buddha will always be in the Buddha's presence and will attain the vast nirvana. And his pure body is the color of gold, beautiful is the protector of the world. Whoever visualizes him like this practices the meditation of the Bodhisattvas. In keeping with this, we should practice remembering our incomparable teacher, the Lord of Sages, in the following way. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. In the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, I take refuge until I attain enlightenment. Through the merit of practicing generosity and so on, may I attain Buddhahood for the benefit of all beings. May all sentient beings enjoy happiness and the causes of happiness. May they be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May they never be separated from the sacred happiness devoid of suffering. And may they dwell in boundless equanimity that is free from attachment and aversion. As the union of unborn emptiness and the ceaseless appearances of interdependence, magically there appears before me in the sky amidst vast clouds of offerings, on a jewel lion throne, lotus sun and moon disk seats, the incomparable teacher, lion of the Shakyas. His body the color of gold, adorned with major and minor marks, clad in the 3 Dharma robes, he sits in Vajra posture. His right hand gracefully poised in the earth-touching mudra, and his left hand in the gesture of meditation, holding in his arms full of nectar. Like a mountain of gold, magnificent, he shines in splendor, spreading beams of wisdom light across the whole expanse of space. The 8 closed sun, 16 elders, and the like, a vast ocean-like retinue of noble beings encircles him all around. Simply think of him and he grants the glory of the highest bliss. liberation from samsara and nirvana, the two extremes. He is the great being, perfect embodiment of every source of refuge. With your great compassion, you embraced this turbulent and degenerate world and made 500 mighty aspirations. You are as exalted as the white lotus. Whoever hears your name shall never return to samsara. Most compassionate teacher, to you I pay homage. All my own and others' virtues, the body, speech, and mind, together with all our possessions, visualized like Samantabhadra's offering clouds, I offer to you. All the harmful actions and transgressions I have committed throughout beginningless time, each and every one I now confess with intense and heartfelt regret. In all virtuous actions of the noble ones and ordinary beings, accumulated throughout the past, present, and future, I rejoice. Turn the wheel of the profound and vast Dharma teaching ceaselessly and in every direction, I pray. Your wisdom body is like space and remains changeless throughout past, present, and future. Yet in the perception of those to be guided, you go through the display of birth and death. Even so, let your form body continue always to appear. Through all the virtues I have accumulated in the past, am accumulating now, and will accumulate in the future, for the sake of benefiting all beings who are as infinite as space, may you, the sovereign of Dharma, be forever pleased, and may all attain the state of the victorious one, the Lord of Dharma. Living beings like us, adrift in this degenerate age, have no guidance nor protection. Because of your kindness caring for us with surpassing compassion, every manifestation in this world now of the three jewels is your enlightened activity. You are then our only refuge, incomparable, supreme. So from our hearts we pray with total confidence and faith. Do not neglect the great promises you made in times gone by, but hold us until we attain enlightenment with your compassion. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, to you, in you I take refuge. Supreme Teacher, Bhagavan Tathagata, Arhat, complete and perfect Buddha, glorious conqueror, Shakyamuni Buddha, to you I pay homage, to you I make offerings, in you I take refuge. Te yatao muni muni maha munaya soha. 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 O muni muni maha munaya soha. O muni muni maha munaya soha. Om Muni Muni Maha Munaya Soha. Om Muni Muni Maha Munaya Soha. Muni Muni Maha Munaya Soha. Muni Muni Maha Munaya Soha. Om Muni Muni Maha Munaya Soha. Muni Muni. Om Mani Muni Mahamunaye Soha. From the Buddha's body there emanates a great radiance, a multicolored rays of wisdom light, dispelling all our own and others' obscurations and causing all the genuine qualities of the Mahayana path to rise within us, so that we attain the level of perfection from which we will never return again to samsara. The miraculous display of the unsurpassable wisdom appears as the intentions, deeds, prayers, knowledge, love, and ability of all the Sugatas and their children. May all beings become exactly like them. I prostrate to all the Buddhas and to the Bodhisattvas endowed with the divine eye of the sages, and to the Shravakas as well. I prostrate to Bodhicitta, which counteracts birth in all lower realms, perfectly shows the path to the higher realms, and leads to no aging nor death. Whatever negative actions I have done under the influence of an afflicted mind, in the presence of the Buddhas, I fully acknowledge them all. By the accumulation of any merit I have created through the three kinds of activities, may my seed of omniscience grow, and may I attain awakening that never ends. Whatever offerings to the Buddhas that can be found in realms of the 10 directions are known to the Buddhas who rejoice in them. I rejoice in all these offerings. I fully acknowledge all negative actions and rejoice in all merit. I prostrate to all the Buddhas. May I attain supreme primordial wisdom. I earnestly request the Bodhisattvas who reside on the 10 levels in all the direction of the worlds in the 10 directions to awaken into supreme enlightenment. Once you have awakened into genuine enlightenment and tamed the Maras and their hordes, may you turn the wheel of Dharma so that all living beings may be healed. With the sound of the great Dharma drum, may you free all beings who are suffering. Throughout inconceivable millions of kalpas, may you remain and teach the Dharma. Mired in the swamp of desire, entangled in the strands of cyclic existence, I am fettered by all that binds. I supplicate those supreme among humans to look upon me. The Buddhas do not blame sentient beings who are flawed. With a loving heart for all sentient beings, may the Buddhas free them from the ocean of cyclic existence. Any perfect Buddhas who are present, those who have passed away, and those yet to come, may I train following in their way and engage in enlightened conduct. Having perfected the 6 paramitas, may I liberate the 6 families of sentient beings. Having actualized the 6 extraordinary faculties, may I reach unexcelled enlightenment. Future phenomena are not born, and those past will not occur. Present phenomena have no inherent nature. There is no actual location. There is no perception. There are no outer things. May I realize the Dhammadhatu of emptiness. According to the Buddhas, the great sages, there are no truly existent sentient beings nor life force. There is no truly existent individual and no nurturing of a self. May I realize the Dhammatā where the self is not present. An entity such as grasping onto a self in mind is not present within any of the paramitas. To benefit all sentient beings, may I give with generosity, free of avarice. Since things do not exist as entities, may my wealth appear spontaneously. Since all things totally disintegrate, may I perfect the paramita of generosity. Endowed with a flawless ethics that is guided by rules, and an ethics that is completely pure, with an ethics free of an arrogant mind, may I perfect the paramita of ethics. Just as the elements of earth, water, fire, and wind, bodhisattvas do not remain caught by mental constructs. By attaining patience, anger never arises. May I perfect the paramita of patience. Through the power of previous perseverance, having become stable, enthusiastic, and free of laziness, and through a strong body and mind, may I perfect the paramita of perseverance. Through the samadhi where all is illusion-like, through the samadhi of the hero's stride, and through the samadhi that is like a vajra, may I perfect the paramita of meditative concentration. Through actualizing the 3 gates of full liberation, the equal nature of the 3 times, and the 3 types of knowing as well, may I perfect the paramita of prajna. Through persevering in a bodhisattva's practice, may I attain the kaya praised by all the Buddhas, the luminous kaya and the kaya blazing with majesty. Thus may my intention be fulfilled. May I be like the famed Maitreya, who engaged in such a practice, perfected the paramitas, and perfectly abides at the zenith of the 10th level. By this merit, may all attain omniscience, may defeat the enemy wrongdoing. From the stormy waves of birth, old age, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may all beings be freed. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen, may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. May the Buddha appear in this world. May the light of the teaching shine like the sun. May the holders of the teaching live in harmony, and thus may all be auspicious for the teaching to endure. We pray for the good health of the teachers. We pray for their precious lives to be long. We pray for their activities to spread and increase. May we be blessed never to part from the teachers. Akashasya stiti yavat yavatcha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyat jagadukani nignata. Akashasya stiti yavat yavatcha jagataha stiti tavan mama stiti bhuyat jagadukani nignata. Tavan mama stiti bhuyat jagadukani nignata. Tavan mama stiti bhuyat jagadukani nignata. As long as space remains, as long as the world remains, may I too remain to alleviate the sufferings of the world. Oh. Okay, thank you, all of you, coming. Someone's asking about the taka that I'm displaying here online. It's actually from Rigpa, and I actually don't know. I think probably you can find it online somewhere, which I did, but I'm not exactly sure where I got it. Okay, thanks all of you. See you.